All right, yeah, we've got another fantastic roundtable set up for you. And just look at this group of panelists. We've got Thomas Davis, longtime NFL veteran, outside linebacker with Washington, 2014 Walter Payton Man of the Year award winner. We are joined by Maya Wiley, an attorney who is also the university professor at the New School in New York, and she also served as the chairman of the New York City Oversight Board, which oversaw a lot of police misconduct, and also J.A. Adande, the director of sports journalism at the Medill School at Northwestern University, longtime reporter for ESPN, and like me, an ex-Washington Post expatriate. Thank you guys so much for joining us. And Thomas, I want to kick this off with you. You've been in the NFL for 16 years. You've played in a Super Bowl. You've won a ton of awards. But we are seeing something now with NFL players speaking out. The activism has been there to some point, but now it seems like a next level. Do you feel with your peers and what you're seeing out of a lot of these younger players that they are finally starting to exert their influence to the point where we saw Roger Goodell in a statement say that the NFL could not be what it is without its black players?
Absolutely. I think that these guys are using their voices and they're using it in the right way. It's all about doing things to create change. And creating that video, when you look at the video that some of the guys, and Michael Thomas and DeAndre Hopkins and some of those other guys were able to put on, I think that really kind of forced the NFL's hand to really listen. You have to listen to these players because so long guys wanted to do things. They wanted to protest. They wanted to really voice their opinions on how they felt, but you kind of felt stronghold. Like if you did something or if you said something that you would kind of be put in the position that Colin Kaepernick has been placed in and kind of blackballed, so to say, from the league. But when you look at Commissioner Goodell come out and make a statement saying that Black Lives Matter, saying that, they were wrong in not listening to the players, I think for us as players, that speaks volumes and it shows that the NFL is starting to get it. They're starting to listen. And now we can start to see some of the change within our league that we wanted to see as players.
Jay, you heard Thomas talk about NFL players fearing reprisal because of what they saw with Colin Kaepernick. You covered the NBA for a long time where there are guaranteed contracts. And so players seem to be more outspoken in the NBA and WNBA. When you view the two different sports and now you see NFL players not worrying so much about those those non-guaranteed contracts like Thomas was just talking about, is this a paradigm shift?
It is, but there's a prominence that NFL players have and the ability and willingness to yield that power that they have. I wrote a story for The Undefeated this week in which I mentioned 80% of the touchdowns scored in the NFL last season were scored by African-American players. And also something I'll add to that, for the first time, the reigning NFL MVP and the reigning Super Bowl MVP are black quarterbacks. So it's one thing to score touchdowns, but the league and the public really values the people that throw the passes for those touchdowns. And increasingly, those are black faces. And so the presence of Patrick Mahomes in that video last week really elevated the power of it. The reigning Super Bowl MVP, the future of the league really is an African-American quarterback and the power that he understands that he holds now. And we've seen the result. Roger Goodell basically bent the knee, to use the Game of Thrones terminology. And, this is a shift. Having so many prominent black quarterbacks is something the NFL really hasn't seen before.
Maya, if you could take us through some of the things. We saw 4 years ago Colin Kaepernick not stand for the national anthem to heighten the awareness of police brutality or the lack of prosecution for police who have soiled the badge of law enforcement. From what you did in your oversight in New York and now hearing louder pleas to defund police departments or redirect money. And a lot of these pleas are coming from NFL players. From your history, of again holding policemen accountable, and to what we're seeing now, is there a difference? Is there more potential for change?
Well, I certainly think there's a huge potential for change, and that potential has been generated from both the symbolism and the importance of a Colin Kaepernick starting to take a knee unorganized, right? Not part of an organized movement, just doing it out of his own sense of consciousness of the experience of far too many Black people in this country. And then it, catching flame because it touched on something that was so many people's experience, and including people who are Black and celebrities. It's not something that was only an experience if you were low income and Black in a poor community. You could be at any income level and had a negative experience with police and have it feel very clearly about your race. I think that the demonstrations themselves that have just galvanized the attention of the country has clearly impacted public opinion. And in the same way that we started to see the debate that NFL players helped to generate because they took a knee, the same way we saw Colin Kaepernick engaging in a conversation with a white player who was a friend of his in how the white player felt as a vet about thinking it was disrespectful. That's the kind of conversation that, I think built some public opinion and some public knowledge. And, a little bit of what we're seeing now, and frankly, I think including the public statement of the NFL is very much about the pressure that demonstrations have brought about. I mean, I think we want to see not just a win record, but a woke record. And I'm not sure we have a woke record unless we're acknowledging that, just as J.A. said, that Colin Kaepernick was a talented quarterback who, frankly, after he started taking a knee, became disrespected in his abilities as a player in order to justify his no longer playing in the league. What demonstrators are out here today saying is, frankly, we're going to be out here no matter what, and it has significantly changed the attitudes of a large number of Americans. We've seen it jump from a little over 50% believing that racism and race discrimination was a serious issue in this country to now it being 74%. 2 weeks of demonstrations have significantly increased America's understanding that racism and discrimination is still a problem. And I think Black athletes have played a substantial role in that over the past few years in helping to elevate that awareness as well.
J.A., I want to follow up on something, and I would love, Maya, and for you and Thomas to chime in on this, because J.A. and I had a conversation, and he brought up an incredible point. So we're all home during COVID-19. We're all locked in on this. And, Jay, you mentioned essential workers and the importance of essential workers having to fight through the potential of the spread of the COVID-19. And I want you to elaborate on your point because it is an incredible jumping off point for some of the shift of thought and behavior that we're seeing right now.
Right. For many white people, if you didn't realize the importance of Black people to the functionality of this country, you did so now. Here in Chicago, and I'm sure this applies to many other locations, but the people stocking your grocery shelves are Black. The people driving the buses so those other workers can get to work are Black. The people, if you are sick and you go to the hospital, the people taking your vital signs and checking you in are Black. And they have been labeled essential. We've seen this country would not be able to function right now as ever without Black people. So as a result, I think we've never seen the needs, wants, concerns of Black people centralized in the way they are right now. And I do think part of that is, again, we've had prominent African Americans in the entertainment and the sports world so far, but the realization, being forced to really examine the essential nature of African Americans in this country, I think has prompted some of this outcry and some of this unified outcry, and just the changing demographics and the perspective of younger people. It was so encouraging to see Joey Burrow, the #1 overall draft pick in the NFL, white quarterback, chime in early on. Trevor Lawrence, the championship quarterback at Clemson, chiming in early on. And that's something you didn't see the last time around when Colin Kaepernick was doing this virtually by himself.
Yeah, I think Jay is making such an important point here. I'd add to the list nurses. 30% of nurses are Black in this country. It's a huge percentage of the nursing population. And, nurses have become very visible parts of the hero population. By the way, nurses are also men. They're not just women. We have a lot of Black male nurses. So it's also very visual. It also couples with the fact that Black people have had the disproportionately high rates of death because of this coronavirus, and to the tune of 30% higher death rates, like literally 30% higher, like staggering. Cities like New Orleans, 70% of deaths. That is in part because people are in the most dangerous jobs when we have a pandemic because they are showing up to work every day despite the pandemic. It is also because we are more likely to have really bad air. Asthma rates are one of the things that were overlooked as a risk factor in a lot of the public reporting around who is at risk for coronavirus. Well, it's a respiratory disease. And because people in Black communities are more likely to have very bad air quality, they're also therefore more likely to be susceptible to coronavirus. And those conditions are conditions of race discrimination, of the inability to get housing fairly and affordably. And those are the kinds of concerns that are coupled with what we're seeing in the police reform movement in a substantial way. Because remember, defund the police. While there are some who want abolition of policing, a huge number of those advocates are talking about how do we redirect our resources? How do we take the peace dividend from the fact that crime rates have dropped for 30 straight years and only 5% of police stops are for serious crime? 5%. Many, many, many police calls could go to somebody else, somebody who does mental health services, somebody who can solve a problem when the police get called for something low level. And that means that we could put more resources into things like public health, into things like counseling services, into things like education, things that matter to creating more opportunity, more health, more safety. And I think both these pandemics together, the pandemic of police violence and the pandemic of the coronavirus, are coming together to show America it can't be working right. We can't be living up to our values and our beliefs and our aspirations as a country if we can see a whole population of people identifiable by the color of their skin and therefore by the problems they have that we have not solved, that we in fact created. And that's our opportunity.
I absolutely agree with that sentiment and what Maya just talked about, because when I think about, the essential workers and you think about how it directly affects the people and the kids and the families that we work with firsthand right here in Charlotte with my foundation. You think about, I work with a bunch of disenfranchised youth, and we work to try to give back to these families. These are the families that need those resources. These are the people in the African-American community that are struggling. When you think about the number of people that have lost their jobs throughout this COVID-19 crisis and the things that are going on. So when you talk about reallocating funds and giving it back to certain places, it starts right there in the center with the people that we work with directly. So I'm definitely excited about hearing that and knowing that these funds are going to go to people that definitely need them to increase and improve the value of their lives.
Let's take this to children and parenting, because we're seeing so much of the wave of what's going on being generated by young people. But Thomas, this has been a common theme in trying to make people, when we talk about empathy and understanding, you've got 4 kids, and you've had that talk with your kids about how to handle themselves should they ever be confronted by the police, whether they're driving or whatever. How are they handling this? Seeing images every day, whether they're cops shooting hoops or doing things fantastic, or during these protests, pepper spraying or baton beating people who are just on the streets trying to make a change.
It's extremely tough as a parent, especially as a Black parent in today's America. When you think about having to have these conversations and talking about certain situations with your kids, man, it gets extremely emotional. A few years ago in Charlotte, we had the police shooting with Keith Lamont Scott, and that was the first time that I really had to sit down with my kids and have a conversation with them about, if you ever pulled over by the police or if you ever are confronted by the police, just comply, do the things that are being asked of you, and you're going to make it home safe. As the years have gone on and as we continue to evolve and see things happen, that's no longer applicable. You can't tell your kids that and just feel certain as a parent that those things are going to happen. Like those things are going to be what brings your kids home safely. Because as we've seen, you comply, you do the things that are asked, and people are still being killed. And as a parent, it's extremely tough having that conversation, because we sat down at the church the other day after the George Floyd incident, and we're watching CNN, and we're seeing all the different protests, and we're seeing the looting, we're seeing the violence, and one of my kids make a statement and says, now we're being heard. Now we're going to see the change that we seek. And as a parent, like I struggled with that, because I don't want my kids growing up thinking like you have to be destructive. You have to feed into the narrative of who people think that we already are as African-American people. They think that we're destructive. They think that we are aiming to go out and just destroy and tear things down. And in the process of trying to explain that, I explained to them, this is not the first time that we've protested, that we've rioted, that we've looted, and not have the opportunity to see change. As a parent, you try to explain to them different ways and different routes of going about things. And it got extremely emotional. My kid ended up crying from me trying to explain it. And, as parents, this is something that we shouldn't have to go through. We shouldn't have to explain to our kids about simply just leaving the house and telling them things that they need to know to get back home safely. And I think right now, the conversations are being had, people are understanding, and now we're going to start transitioning to where we don't hopefully someday we don't have to do this anymore.
Well, Maya, I want to come to you and piggyback off of that. Don't worry, Jay, I got something for you after this. But something was said to me this past weekend by a friend of mine where she said her young daughter, 7, 8 years old, walked into the room and was watching the news and saw a police officer nightsticking a protester. And the child was mortified. Like, what's going on here? I thought the police were the good guys. And, you think about young children, we teach them that the police are good, that this is something to aspire to be, that this is whom you run to for safety. And as Thomas just said, hopefully one day we won't be having to have this conversation with people, teenagers, your kids. But we've got a young group of kids now, too, who are seeing this. How might these images, or how might what they're seeing, people walking down their streets, affect them? And what could be the long-term play with that?
It's such an important question and such a painful one. Let me say two things. We've actually been seeing these videos since 1990s. I mean, we had 1992, we had Rodney King. Those were astonishingly traumatic videos, and we had the uprising in Los Angeles as a result of the acquittal of those police officers and some violence. I am not a proponent of violence, obviously. But this is the failure of the justice system and the failure of that oversight and the failure of a society refusing to see as people worthy of investment, people in Black community, is part of why the outrage sometimes spills over. And that's not a defense, but it is so important to understand it. And it's also important to understand that unfortunately, we've been seeing a growth of these videos. We've been seeing more and more. My children, when they saw that video, and they're teenagers now, but it was far from the first one they saw, and they saw it before I did. We had a conversation about how traumatizing it was because they were preparing me. They were concerned about me seeing the video. And I was traumatized. And I think we should be honest about the fact that there is an impact to these. I was traumatized by Trayvon Martin. My children were traumatized by Trayvon Martin, and we only had the audio tape. We just knew what happened. I think there is a collective kind of trauma that these videos create, and you're absolutely right about the fact that it drives people from seeing police as problem solvers and rather seeing them as punishers. And we know as a result, there's some statistics that suggest literally 40% of reports that should go to the police don't, because people are scared of calling them. Think about what happened in the George Floyd case. The shop owner who knew George Floyd, who happened not to be there that day when that $20, fraudulent bill was passed, he said he wouldn't have called the police. He has incredible guilt about not being there, so that the police were not called. And the instinct there is really about a kind of understanding that they are not always going to respond in the way we want them to or we think they should, because of the way too often Black people are feared and stereotyped. So even when you behave, as we saw in the George Floyd videotape, he was not resisting arrest. He was saying, sir, as we heard from his brother when he testified before Congress, then begging for his life and completely unable to fight in any way. And yet he is now dead. And we are not going to change perceptions on policing until policing itself changes.
Jay, I want to go down kind of this line of thinking here with you, because you've been covering sports for so long. And Thomas, if you wouldn't mind chiming in as well. So we're talking about this trauma that we've seen, that our children are seeing and experiencing. And we're seeing the NBA's getting ready to kick back up. The NFL's getting ready to kick back up. Other sports are kicking back up. Teams are going to have to deal with this in some way, shape, or form, whether it's mental health. Sure, some people might be able to compartmentalize and say, I can go do my job and deal with what I got to do with my kids and what they're going through, but maybe not everybody. How do you think teams are going to have to adjust to the potential mental health issues of a player or players, their families, because of what they're experiencing with the George Floyd issue and with this pandemic, which has affected a lot of different people in a lot of different ways?
Well, one of the things we've seen in the 4 years since Colin Kaepernick has been an adjustment and an awareness that there needs to be more attention paid to mental health. And certainly the NBA has played a prominent role in that discussion. Players like Kevin Love and DeMar DeRozan stepping forward and talking about the mental health struggles that they've had and hoping to further the discussion. And I think that's something in the NFL as well. Really, from my perspective as a journalism professor, I'm curious about the media coverage and what it will be like this time, and if we have another round of protests during the league, and will the media get it right this time? I'd give a 2.5-hour lecture every year about how the media failed on the Colin Kaepernick story. Not you, Steve Wyche. You got it right initially, asking the first most important question to Colin Kaepernick: why are you doing this? And I'll give the San Francisco area media credit. They asked the necessary follow-up question: what would it take for you? What are your concerns? And what would it take for you to feel comfortable standing for the anthem again? And that's when he got into the details about police brutality. But it quickly became about the flag and disrespecting the military and all of these sideshows that entered. And we failed to maintain a focus on the central question, which is, how do we feel about unarmed American citizens being killed by agents of the state and not facing any punishment for it? And it gets back to the story you told about the little girl asking, having doubts about the police. If our kids can't believe in the intents and the intentions and the heart, the good hearts of the police officers who are charged with serving and protecting them, if we can't have a belief in that in our children, we don't have a functional society. And so that's why this is such an important discussion. And that's why maybe it's even an outsized discussion, because, we're really talking 250, maybe 300 people, African Americans per year, who are killed by the police. And there's maybe about 300,000 African American deaths per year. So such a tiny percentage of the number of African Americans who die per year are killed at the hands of the police. But again, this is an essential part of our society, and how we're going to protect, serve, enforce the law All of these things come into play, and that's why this has become the focal point. And it's really important that the media maintains the discussion on that. When it sidetracks, even the discussion of whether or not Colin Kaepernick should have a job in the NFL this year, that gets away from the message he was trying to spread, which was about police brutality.